Yeah, London. Sure. Thanks very much, and thanks for having me on. It's great to be with you and with our viewers. Um, so as you mentioned, I'm based in London, and it was here that I started to see a bit of a phenomenon called tikkun olam, which literally means kind of repair the world, and we can come on to what exactly it means shortly. But I kind of saw elements of it in the UK some years ago, and I started calling it out. I said, this is nonsense. This is kind of baloney. It has no basis in kind of traditional Judaism. It's a mask for certain politics and so on, and sort of people kind of goaded me to write about it. So I did. I wrote a short essay about it. Then I moved to the States for a time. I lived on the East Coast in New York City, and there I really saw this phenomenon, this Tikkun Olam movement up close in a way that I'd really never in the UK noticed or encountered it before, because it's quite a uniquely American phenomenon. So what you see kind of in the UK and other communities is an echo really of what's going on in America. That's the real deal. And then seeing it up close, then I decided to write about it. And there were kind of a couple of things, or three things even, that really kind of motivated me about it. One was, as I said, I saw this phenomenon. I said that people here are thinking they're doing Judaism, or claiming that they're doing Judaism, when they're not. This whole Tikkun Olam idea has no traditional kind of basis. So they're wrong to do it, and they're wrong to hold themselves out as doing Judaism and to claim this is Judaism. So that was a first motivation. A second was to say, well, actually, let's look at the American Jewish community, where assimilation rates are kind of through the roof. By that we mean people who are moving away from the Jewish community, which is a sad thing for those who are committed to the community and to its sustainability and to its future. And I looked at the denominations, the American Jewish denominations that are most dedicated to Tikkun Olam, most committed to Tikkun Olam, have the highest assimilation rate. So I wanted to know as well, is there a connection between those two things? And thirdly, and most importantly, was this idea that Tikkun Olam and those espousing it, they somehow could claim a sort of Jewish legitimation for their hostility toward Israel. And that was something that really got me. I said to myself, how are there people here who are claiming that Judaism somehow endorses their hostility to Israel, their opposition to Israel? So that really sort of piqued my interest, and also got me very kind of emotionally interested in the project, and so on. So that's sort of a bit about me and how I came to write this. Actually, quite sort of similar-ish background to you. My parents are both Israeli as well, so I'm first generation British, but I was born and raised in this country. And my parents are sort of kind of very kind of middle of the road, and I've sort of taken a greater interest in Judaism since I was very young, since kind of youth. So yeah, so the book is, I mean, here's a copy for anyone who wants to see it. The book is called to yeah, exactly. There you go. So it's called To Heal the World, which is a sort of poetic, rendering of Tikkun Olam, usually translated as repair the world, fix the world, perfect the world, and so on. Now, this is a phrase that, comes up in a few different places in rabbinic writings. But interestingly, and this is a very important point, I think, that it doesn't come up anywhere in the Bible. Nowhere in the Torah, nowhere in the Old Testament. Which is an extraordinary thing. There are vast swathes of American Jews and indeed Jews around the world who believe that Tikkun Olam is not only a commandment, a mitzvah, and sort of a Jewish imperative, but actually that it's the central tenet, the central message of Judaism, and yet it doesn't occur a single time in the Bible, which is an amazing thing. Every other major concept in Judaism, from the creation of the world, the giving of the Torah, the election of Abraham, the land of Israel, the Sabbath, the kosher laws, the Messiah, you name it, it's there, except, Tikkun Olam is not at all. So that already should send, raise some red flags. The phrase comes up kind of predominantly in four main places. The first is in the Aleinu prayer. This is a prayer that comes from one of the services on Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, that was then incorporated into all daily services. So it's very familiar to kind of practicing Jews. The second is in the Talmud, which is a sort of well-known, a very large corpus of rabbinic discussions. The third is in the Midrash, which is a certain type of kind of theological interpretations of sources, texts, verses in the Bible. And the fourth is in Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, and particularly that of Isaac Luria, a rabbi from about 400 years ago in this kind of Lurianic Kabbalah. So to kind of look a bit more in depth, Aleinu is split into two paragraphs. There's a sort of first particularistic paragraph that talks about the Jewish people, and the second one is much more universalistic and deals with the whole world. And there you have this phrase, Litaken olam b'malchut shakai, to repair, fix, perfect the world under the kingdom of God. But whereas today Tikkun Olam is understood as a political program, and particularly a left-wing political program of social justice and political advocacy, there's nothing like that in the text of Aleinu, which is about the entire world coming to serve the God of Israel in a sort of messianic in a messianic time. That's the kingdom of God that Aleinu anticipates. As it happens, even the L'Tikkun Olam part, this Tikkun Olam part, is probably a corruption. That probably actually wasn't the original Hebrew, and I talk about that in the book, but you can kind of leave that aside. But this paragraph beseeches God to bring the world under his kind of sole kingship. It's not advocating for man to get involved in political work. That's the first one. Then in the Talmud, there's a phrase, Mipnei Tikkun Ha'olam, for the repair of, literally kind of for the repair of the world, but what it means in context is sort of for the better ordering of society or something along those lines. Really what it's trying to do, the rabbis are bringing this rationale to close loopholes, to kind of do slight tweaks in the existing law in order to sustain the system. So I'll give you an example. It's particularly used in the context of divorce law. So for instance, in Talmudic times, a man could send a get, a writ of divorce, to his wife who lived somewhere else via an emissary. Now, he sends the emissary off with this document, and he could then change his mind and say, actually, you know what, I don't want to divorce my wife, I'm annulling the get. But of course, the emissary has already left. He's got this get. He thinks that it's all legitimate. He gives it to the wife. She assumes it's legitimate. She believes she's divorced. She may go on to remarry. She may have children. And those children then have a very difficult status because they are born to, a woman who has essentially committed adultery. But she, of course, had no idea. So it's a completely inequitable situation and a loophole that the rabbis sought to close. So mipnei tikkun ha'olam, for this kind of better ordering of society, or to close these loopholes, or whatever translation you want to give it, they close that and say that once the emissary is left, you can no longer do this. And there are a few other examples along those lines. What's extraordinary is that you think that, this is a rationale that could be used for any number of things, right? You could tweak any number of laws that you wanted to using this. So actually, it's so sparing. The rabbis are so sparing in their use of this rationale that is itself telling. It occurs almost exclusively in fact exclusively in one tractate, and almost exclusively in one chapter of one tractate, of tens of tractates in the Talmud. So used very sparingly, and then throughout the succeeding 1500 years of rabbinic responsa, used very, very rarely. So that in itself is telling that this had a very particular usages, this rationale, and was certainly not, despite what today's Tikkun Olam activists would have us believe, certainly not about totally revolutionizing society. It wasn't about, Mipanei Tikkun Olam, we can totally overturn our economy, overturn our society, and so on. It's to the contrary. This is about upholding the existing society and making the kind of gradualist reforms that keep societies going. In the Midrash, very briefly, this derivatives of this phrase Tikkun Olam come up here and there in very kind of esoteric circumstances and contexts that again have nothing to do with kind of contemporary politics. And Lurianic Kabbalah again is an incredibly mystical idea where the creation of the world was essentially God contracting himself in order to create a space for something other than him to exist, and that he puts certain elements of divinity, divine lights or sparks, into mystical vessels. These are not material things, mystical vessels that cannot contain these sparks, and the vessels break up. And essentially, it's the role of the Jews, or perhaps mankind as a whole, to restore these divine sparks to their source, and they do that through prayer and fulfilling the mitzvot, the commandments. So again, none of this is physical. None of this has anything to do with politics whatsoever. Like, we're talking about totally other worlds, and this is in a sense. There is nothing in Lurianic Kabbalah that suggests that you help to restore these divine sparks by going out on a protest or donating to your to a congressional re-election campaign, right? There's no connection whatsoever. So those are the appearances of this phrase in traditional Judaism. They mean different things in all the different contexts. There is no one Tikkun Olam, nor was this a concept of any importance, really, other than, as I said, in a very particular Talmudic section, and in kind of Lurianic Kabbalah in a very particular context. But beyond that, this wasn't some grand concept in Judaism, and it arose much more recently in this newfangled way. The first usage that I found, which is earlier than kind of some others, was in the 1930s, but didn't really get popularized until the 1980s by Jewish radicals, people on the far left, like Michael Lerner and others, who went on to found Tikkun magazine and did so much to popularize this phrase. They essentially alighted on a Hebraic phrase to denote the kind of social justice, political radicalism that they were involved in. And what's extraordinary about the story of this is how quickly it moved from the radical fringes, from organizations that the community didn't have a huge amount of time for at all, into the mainstream, that today, it's totally taken over. Reform, conservative, renewal, reconstructionist Judaism is making inroads into orthodoxy as well, and people think this is the essence of Judaism. It's something that was on the fringes, within the lifetimes of most people.
So we'll get to that. First, the audience just want to apologize. My audio was bad at the beginning. They could hear you. So the questions at the beginning, of course, were what Jonathan Neumann's background is in terms of how he came to write the book, To Heal the World. And then, of course, I explained my own background, growing up with a secular, my mother was agnostic, sort of could have fallen into the same category as some of these people. In terms of my own viewpoints, I hated President Bush as a kid and all that type of stuff, the Iraq War, and eventually, my sort of worldview developed largely due to military service and, of course, discovering libertarian economics. But the question he just answered was about the actual meaning of the Tikkun Olam concept within Judaism and within texts like, Lurianic Kabbalah, which was in the Middle Ages, I believe, right? The 15th century?
kind of 15th, 16th century. Yeah, exactly.
So
Like later on.
the next question, so you're already getting into it, but you described in addition the main topic of Tikkun Olam, the evolution of Reform Judaism and other denominations toward an assimilationist identity up until the 1940s. The refocusing on Tikkun Olam came later. Please explain how that happened.
So, I mean, the story of Tikkun Olam, in a sense, starts like all kind of modern Jewish stories with the emancipation back in Europe, different what became the different streams of Judaism as we know them today, kind of neo-Orthodox or modern Orthodox and strictly Orthodox, Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, Reform Judaism, and so on, all arose in that period. And essentially, for the reformers, they wanted to try to integrate to the max in kind of contemporary Germany, but without kind of the full assimilation and conversion. They still wanted sort of vestiges of Jewish life, and the emancipationist bargain was that you could integrate and participate fully in kind of German Central European life, but you had to keep your Judaism kind of private. It wasn't a public thing. It became a kind of a private religious endeavor, and Jews became sort of Germans of the Mosaic persuasion. They were no longer they could no longer see themselves as part of a Jewish nation because they were full citizens of Germany. So they dropped the idea of Jewish peoplehood, and with that they dropped the idea of the land of Israel and returning to the land of Israel. Germany was the new promised land, and Berlin was the new Zion. But they needed kind of something new. If that wasn't the messianic hope to return to the land of Israel, then they needed something new. And that's something that they got from German culture. They took the universalist ethics of Immanuel Kant and the sort of Wellhausian idea of a kind of prophetic legacy, that the prophets of ancient Israel developed a universalistic religion, that they kind of overturned Mosaic legal kind of strictures and so on, and that obsession, the Jewish obsession with law and particularism and so on, and replaced it with this kind of universalistic religion of universal morality and so on. So this religion, this kind of Reform Judaism, gets transplanted into the United States, where it becomes the dominant faith, and you start to see in kind of the late 1800s more of a kind of political interest, like in the Pittsburgh Platform in the 1880s, for example. It talks about the need to address the evil kind of contrasts within society, sort of starting to make a kind of political points about power and so on in society. Still at that time, these were still sort of utopian ideas. There wasn't really political activism. What changed was in the early 1900s with the social gospel, a liberal Christian movement where led by ministers and academics and so on, who were engaged in sort of what was then kind of very left-wing radical activism. And the Reform Jews were very kind of taken by this. I mean, part of what Reform Judaism was about replicating what was going on in wider society, because the whole point was about kind of integrating and so on. So they took a lot of interest in the social gospel and its politics. What's interesting about the theology behind the social gospel was that the leaders of it were believed in kind of post-millennialism, which was a Christian theology that believed that Christ could only return after 1,000 years of the kingdom of God, of social justice on earth. Traditionally Christians would often think that Christ initiates, the second coming initiates a period like that, but they believed actually that he would only come after. What that meant was that it was up to man to implement, to introduce this period. And they called it the kingdom of God, which sounded like a very Christian idea, from the Lord's Prayer, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. They're building the kingdom of God on earth. And the Jews got quite enamored with this and got really involved in this political activism as well, and even surpassed the Christians in their zeal for it. So this was where social justice and the politics of social justice really got involved. the Jews wanted their own kind of phrase to capture what they were doing. The Christians had the kingdom of God. In my view, the Jews alighted. That's when they alighted on this idea in Aleinu of perfecting the world under the kingdom of God, and it was the kingdom of God part that interested them at first, and now, of course, it's just the Tikkun Olam part. The phrase still didn't really become popular until, as I said, until the 80s, where it was sort of resuscitated by these radicals. The shift in kind of reform and conservative Judaism, what I was describing was classical reform that then became kind of modern reform, became a lot more kind of traditional in its practices. So, for example, you'll no longer find synagogues that hold their major service on a Sunday, which you used to find, in classical reform. The reform movement also became more Zionist as well, from going from rejecting the Promised Land, rejecting a return to Zion, then became more Zionist. And some of the key leaders of American Zionism were from the reform movement. But reform retained and conservative adopted as well this interest in social justice activism. That never left from the social gospel onwards. And it was only later when radicals started to call that, well, we're going to call that Tikkun Olam again. We're going to, it then sort of moved back into the mainstream to call it that. But this idea of this political social justice, left-wing political activism has stayed throughout that period.
So and we'll get to some of that too, because I actually found a specimen of that. Nowadays, in the Tikkun Olam ideology seems to be linked with mainly civic and environmental causes. But where is the place of God and the spiritual person within it? Do its supporters in Jewish congregations make a distinction between the spiritual significance of Jewish worship and other religious worship?
It's a very good question. Theologically, as I said, that with the social gospel, central to the idea was that it's up to man to do this. It's up to man to pursue this political advocacy. And the contrast, interestingly, with Aleinu, for example, which is where they first lifted the phrase, is that second paragraph where the phrase appears starts with, therefore, we pray to you, as in to God. The idea that it's God actually who takes the lead in establishing the kingdom of God on earth, as far as the Aleinu prayer sees it. So I think you're absolutely right to raise that, because God has essentially been exorcised from the Tikkun Olam thinking, because the whole point is it's up to man to do it. And if God is too much in that picture, then there's then the place of man is marginalized. You're also right, if I kind of recall your question, to say, well, actually, you sort of go down the line of, well, what's the differentiation between then Judaism as the pursuit of social justice and other faiths, or no faith, right? What's left? What is it that differentiates Judaism? And you're absolutely right to raise that. There are a number of, what's behind the Tikkun Olam movement is the idea that social justice, or Jewish social justice, is that the left-wing politics of social justice are mandated by Judaism, and they point to a number of sources to try to make that claim. And central to those is the creation of the world. And the reason is that they want to locate the source of moral obligation in creation. Now, in traditional Judaism, the source of moral obligation is revelation, is the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And the reason is that is what that establishes or affirms the covenant between the Jewish people and God. And in traditional Judaism establishes that is the source of moral obligation. When Jews ask, how shall I behave? What shall I do? And so on, they look to the Torah that was given by God to the Jews in particular, and is what differentiates the Jews from other nations and from others. It's not a question of being superior. The point is simply about differentiation. But the Tikkun Olam movement doesn't like that. They don't like the idea that Jews are somehow separate from others. They think that that's a chauvinistic idea, and So to get around it, they want to locate moral obligation in creation, because creation implicates everybody, right? Whereas only the Jews were at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. Everybody was at creation, as it were, through Adam, through Adam and Eve. So everybody has exactly the same provenance, come from the same place. They want to claim that everyone has exactly the same rights and obligations to everybody else, and that their destiny is exactly the same. And the problem with that is, what is the role of the Jewish people then? What is the role of having a distinct people? Why do the Jewish people exist? And they have no answer to that question. Now, I should emphasize, that Jews have a heightened obligation to one another. That's the idea of being in covenant. But that's not as controversial as it might seem. It's exactly the same as a family. The Jews see themselves as literally as biological descendants of Abraham, right? Being Jewish goes by your parents, goes by your mother. It's not like in Christianity or in Islam, a question of faith and choosing to enter this. So Judaism sees itself, the Jews see themselves as a family. And just like you have enhanced obligations to your family members, to honor your parents, to love your spouse, to care and provide for your children, the same with Judaism. You have enhanced obligations to fellow Jews, but that doesn't mean that you have no obligations to anyone else or to strangers. Just like in your own family, you have particular obligations to your own family members, but that just because you wouldn't treat a stranger like you treat your own mother, that doesn't mean that you have no moral obligations to strangers either. And Judaism absolutely mandates that both the Gentile and Jewish homeless be sheltered, and both the Gentile Jewish and Gentile hungry be fed, and that the Jewish and Gentile naked be clothed. There's absolutely no question about that. From the charitable point of view, our interest is the politics side. But the point is that if there's no differentiation, there is no role for a Jewish people. And the Tikkun Olam movement has no answer to the question, why be Jewish? If the only role of the Jews in the world is to pursue social justice, and the role of all human beings is to pursue social justice as well, there is no distinction between them. What makes the Jewish people Jewish cannot also be what makes them exactly the same as everybody else. So you're absolutely right to point to that universalist issue. What is interesting, though, that I'll just add to kind of end on this point, on this, is that the Tikkun Olam movement are very big on breaking down barriers between Jews and non-Jews, and not really having a reason for why Judaism should exist, and not really celebrating Jewish culture per se, because really the point of the Jews is to pursue social justice just like everybody else. But what's interesting is that they would never render that sort of evaluation of any other minority group, right? Could you imagine the Tikkun Olam?
I am seeing this. I do know what you mean, but I am seeing this now with regards to the Indians, especially now that Modi is like the prime minister of India, that now you're seeing the same attacks. Like when I was growing up, if you were into yoga or any, learning Hinduism, it was considered a very like great progressive, development in your life. Deeper concepts, George Harrison and all of that. Nowadays, if you are an Indian and you believe in Hindutva, which is the Indian national religious identity, you're considered basically an Islamophobic bigot. And I have, a friend and other people that have talked to me about it who are from India, and they're like, this is ridiculous. India is a nation with a deep religious heritage, obviously very different from Judaism, and they're basically calling us, oppressors of a religious minority, even though Islam for hundreds and hundreds of years oppressed India, not the other way around. But yeah, I mean, you can finish the point. But I found it interesting that we're seeing that now when, just 15 years ago was the opposite.
Right. So that's interesting. I would say with the Jews, it's like a principled thing. I think with the from what you're saying for the Hindus, not necessarily something that I've necessarily kind of noted myself, but I think that's, as you yourself have noted with the Modi thing, I think that's that's like a politically
right, yeah.
Politically charged thing. But this general idea that kind of, there are minorities we like and there are minorities we don't like, and the minorities that we don't like, they should just like disappear. but the minorities that we do like, well, we all have to, celebrate them and celebrate diversity and so on. And we should very much be applauding and so on their heritage and so on, but not our own as Jews and not as you say other minorities that we don't like. So that, I think, is an incredible kind of hypocrisy.
Yeah, I certainly see it in I do see it applied a lot to the Jewish community, and I find it interesting because all the time when I see these progressive Jewish believers, I don't know what to call it, but they're not always leaders, but a lot of them are, they believe in it. They always harken back to Jewish values when, I was, I've obviously read the Bible, most of it. I'm not going to say I read the whole thing, but especially the 5 books of Moses that are read every week, there is a lot of stuff in there that is contradictory to progressivism. There's laws of bondage, there's laws of, stoning sexual degenerates, things like that. So if somebody has a left-wing perspective, it sounds ridiculous to harken back, in my mind, to you should just address your own progressive values. Don't mix it in with a different core set of beliefs. I just find it ridiculous. And I think so. This next question is: how does Tikkun Olam and its precepts define the Jewish identity in terms of religion versus race? Because they do talk about race a lot. In fact, I'll show an example after you answer. What does it have? Where does it have its impact as far as spiritual belief with the race?
That's quite interesting. I'm not sure that I've thought about that in those in those terms. What's your example?
Well, so I've had, over the past 3 years, I could send this to you later. I think you'd find this fascinating, but there are people who are within the Jewish community, and they have this obsession with saying that the Jews cannot be white people. They say that they have to be, in a certain sense, a distinct race, and they try to use genetics in order to, there's a lot of disputed genetics because there's both European and non-European lineage for a lot of Jews. And there even is a writer, he appears all the time in the Times of Israel. His name is Daniel Bean, and I've actually chatted with him on this channel, and he said that to call a Jewish person white is to erase their actual racial identity, which is Levantine. And on the other hand, you have, so let me see if I can share this on your screen so you can see it. This is from the Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. And I'm not sure if you've heard of that group.
Yeah.
But they are from, I think they're from New York, and they're an anti-Zionist group, and they have this Haggadah, which is the BLM Haggadah. And they basically, you can see even for elements of the Passover Seder, which is the ritual retelling of the Exodus from Egypt every year, they add little additions onto every step, and it's amusing and disturbing at the same time. Why in this night, when we remember the oppression and resistance of Jews, should we also think about the lives of people of color? So that's on the Manishtana hymn that is sung during the Passover Seder, which obviously you and I are both familiar with. And the answer is because many Jews are people of color, because racism is a Jewish issue, because our liberation is connected. So that's really what I've seen this a lot, and this is beyond anything I've seen. Even as someone, I have an aunt who lives on a kibbutz, and they have the kibbutz Haggadah, which has, it has a lot of stuff that has to do with, communal living. So that is really what I'm talking about, that they intermingle the actual rituals with their, what do you call racial beliefs.
Well, I mean, look, you're absolutely right on for example, the point you made before. This is about left-wing politics at the end of the day, and not about religion. And as you say, we can, thank God we all live in, we live in democracies, and everyone's entitled to their, can have their political views, and we can and should argue them out in the public square. My interest, and exactly as you've articulated, is attaching those political views to Judaism and claiming that this is what Judaism believes, and that's kind of my endeavor, is to try to show that connection is not reasonable, is not a reasonable and tenable one to make. And you see it that there's these activists, and sometimes they just say it openly. They have their politics before they open the Bible or before they open the Talmud. There is no honest engagement. There is no learning from these texts. They are superimposing their views onto them. They are taking verses out of context, distorting them in some cases, making them up. I mean, to give you an example, you mentioned that there are things in the Bible that do not comport with liberal values, and Michael Lerner, for example, just says, well, he just shoves them into a category that he calls the Joshua tradition, and says that they are not the voice of God. And essentially, to him, how do you know what's the voice of God and what isn't? Well, the things that conform to liberal politics, that's the voice of God, and the stuff that isn't that, that sounds more conservative, that's not the voice of God. It's like, well, this is not real Judaism, is it? This is just people using it for their political ends. And you see that in the expropriation of festivals, and there's a whole section in the book on that, a whole section on Passover and the Seder night and the Haggadahs. And in fact, the book even opens talking about the Obama Seders. Obama was the first president to introduce a regular Seder night into the White House, and the reason is that Seder is absolutely central to the social justice idea, precisely because they're expropriating it in order to use it to associate it with liberation politics and all of that. And the Haggadahs, the book talks about that as well. Any number of these things, exactly as you pointed to, ones that get progressively more and more anti-Israel. It starts with kind of like, we shouldn't just be thinking about, the Jewish story. We should be thinking about other things. Then going to, we should really only be thinking about other things. To then going to, we should be thinking about the Jewish things, but in a negative way. We should be hating on Israel, like, there were 4 cups of wine over the course of the Seder night. So, there's one Haggadah that sort of, kind of 4 cups to BDS, and so on, to the boycott, the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against Israel, and so on. So, that this kind of like offensive garbage. So,
like the Judas Seder that what happened with Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of opposition.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think there are even more extreme groups in the States, but like Jewish Voice for Peace and so on. But exactly along those sorts of lines. But again, it's quite an American phenomenon. This. So yeah, you see that, and exactly in like the the Haggadah that you've brought up. It's all this kind of like, we're sitting down to have a religious and kind of communal cultural experience at the Seder night, trying to connect with Jewish traditions and Jewish generations, going back all this time and so on. And instead of that, it's this attempt to kind of insert all of this all of this other stuff. Now, as I say in the book, we should take a lot of pride in the fact that non-Jews have often looked to the Exodus story as an inspiration for their movements, including political movements and so on. It's wonderful that this great work of Jewish civilization, Jewish literature is being used. Is so inspirational for so many people, and that's a wonderful thing. But that is aside from the central meaning of the story to the Jewish people. That the God of Israel heard the cries of the Jews and brought them out of bondage into His service. That is the central story of the Exodus for the Jews. And as I say in the book, by bringing in all this other foreign politics into it, essentially these Tikkun Olam Jews are reading the Exodus story like non-Jews. They are not seeing the Jewish story. They are not connecting to the Jewish story. They're just looking at this as a template for the liberation politics that they already hold anyway, and that no one's stopping them from going out and pursuing in the street. But why does it have to be, on the Seder night? Why does it have to be in the sanctuary and so on?
Right, and I think it's like really a mark of their intellectual dishonesty when they try to, like, if, like, for example, I have a position, I'm for drug legalization, And if I combed through the entire Torah, I could probably find a number of verses where it would say, okay, maybe we should legalize, for argument's sake, heroin or something. But it's obvious that 5,000 years ago they weren't really concerned with that as much, or the place of stimulants or depressants in society was different. So, I think it's really just, do you see like also a cynical edge to it, that they're trying to appropriate it even though they don't really believe in any of the religious aspect at all? They're essentially atheists that are using this as kind of a cloak for their own belief system, or do you see them as true believers?
I think they are. I think they are true. True believers. I don't think that there's that that element of cynicism. I mean, maybe here and there, but for the most part, they really believe in their politics. I mean, their politics is their religion. That is what they think is the route to salvation. And what I find amazing is that for all that Tikkun Olam Jews will denigrate, for example, the Christian right, for bringing religion into politics and so on. But they've done exactly the same without admitting it. And the Tikkun Olam view is no different. That voting for a certain candidate or pursuing a certain political policy or so on, seals your place in heaven or hell, right? Why is it any different? But at least the Christian right are clear about what they're doing and consistent. They say, we believe religion is a very important thing to us. We believe it has a place in the public square, and we see no reason why it can't form the basis of our political activism and the policies that we pursue. But what you've got with the Tikkun Olam folks is, being on the political left, they believe in a strict separation of church and state, and you get an organization like the Religious Action Center. This is Reform Judaism's political lobbying branch in Washington, D.C. So that already tells you something, right? Reform Judaism has a political lobbying branch called the Religious Action Center, and you go onto their website. They've got an opinion on every issue in American politics and a particular policy on the political left that they're pursuing. And they're basically going to congressmen and saying, you need to pass this legislation or do X and Y because of this, biblical verse or whatever that we've plucked out or that we've distorted or what have you. At the same time as believing in a separation of church and state, and believing, as their website actually says, that they want to protect government from religion. I mean, it's just like staggering. It's staggering hypocrisy, isn't it? At least the Christian right are happy to be, we're religious, we're proud about it, we're fine with it. The Tikkun Olam movement is trying to have it both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know a lot of people who are evangelicals, and they always say openly, vote with your faith. Abortion is it's a mortal issue for your soul. You can save people's lives. And I actually am against abortion. I'm not obviously not because I'm Christian, because I'm not. But I find it's more transparent to talk to some of these people, because they do color their outward political opinions through scripture, as opposed to in many cases with these progressive religious figures, and not only with Judaism, because I'm getting to a different question related to that. They try to make it a lot about guilt, and guilt in light of these new sins. So in your mind, is the effect of this new ideology more severe in the political sphere or the religious one? How does it compare to similar progressive movements within Catholicism, Protestantism, or other religions?
I mean, I can only really speak to to the Jewish side of it. I think it's enormously detrimental to the Jewish community. I mean, firstly, there's the kind of the theological point that we made earlier, which is this is a stridently universalistic ideology, and it has no real place for the Jewish people. So, if you're a Jew kind of thinking about this, and you basically say, well, I want to pursue Tikkun Olam, and Tikkun Olam basically means that everyone's the same and we all owe each other the same. And Jews and non-Jews are no different, and the idea of thinking about Jews as being different is chauvinistic, then actually, well, one of the best things that I can do to create a socially just world is to stop being Jewish. Is to not raise my children as Jews and so on. That's kind of theologically. We also see it empirically, that the surveys show that those who are in those Jews who are doing social justice work in a universalistic, i.e., kind of non-Jewish context, are not interested in then moving to do it in a Jewish context. And why would they be by that logic? It doesn't make sense for them to be. So it's not a way. It's not a way into Judaism. It's not a way into Judaism either. If anything, possibly the opposite. So there's that detriment. There's also, as you mentioned earlier, the fact that this isn't Judaism and this is not an honest encounter with the text. So people are not actually interested in learning from the wisdom of previous generations and from their Jewish civilization. They're interested in taking their politics and plucking out verses and so on to try to justify those politics. And at the end of the day, it really does get pretty stupid to think that a 3,000, 5,000 year old Jewish religious tradition comports entirely to the liberal left platform of the contemporary Democratic Party in the 21st century United States. I mean, it's totally idiotic, but they're literally trying to draw straight lines from something the Bible says to a modern day policy point. It's incredibly detrimental to religion, and it's actually very sad. It leaves no room for personal growth either. I mean, one of the examples I have in the book is there's in one synagogue I bring this example, but there's something that happens across the nation. A rabbi gets up on Rosh Hashanah, the Day of Judgment, the New Year, and delivers a sermon on the theme of judgment. Now, that's exactly as it should be. But traditionally, that sermon would be about judging ourselves, judging our community. How well have we grown in the past year? How can we grow in the coming year? What have we done wrong? What have we done right? Personally, communally, and so on. But that's not what the sermon was about. The sermon was about judgment, but it was about judging everybody else, right? It was about judging all of those kind of conservatives or whatever, all those people whose politics we disagree with. They're in the wrong. All of you sitting in the sanctuary, you're all right. I'm all right. We're not judging ourselves, we're judging everybody else. And it's like, this is the complete opposite of what this is supposed to be. It's like a cheap expropriation that not only doesn't do justice to Judaism, but these rabbis and leaders are failing their own congregants because they're not providing the kind of religious nourishment and personal growth that is what these faiths are there for.
I can tell you that there have been people I've chatted with that I've never met in person from other states who go to conservative synagogues and reform temples who have told me they won't go anymore because it's completely become politicized, or they only go because their spouse wants them to, they drag them along because it's a social event. And I've seen people in my family that are like that, and it's like that it's not only with religion. Obviously, it's become that way with sports, it's become that way with video games, but obviously religion traditionally in society, whether you're Jewish or Irish or whatever ethnicity, religion is supposed to be sort of a core value system. And I think when you taint it with these these positions on everything from birth control all the way to racial animus and things like that. Who enslaved who, and whether George Washington should have his statue up on Mount Rushmore. I think it really does. It cheapens the faith, and I can see that also. That's why I mentioned the other religions. I know people who are Roman Catholic who have the same issue, and they've gone and completely gone the other direction, becoming much more traditionally Catholic and embracing some of the pre-Vatican II positions that are, in many cases they're, honestly I don't agree with them at all. But I have seen, this is something I could probably share with you later. The group, if not now, obviously. I think you've written about them. And I've seen similar organizations trying to infiltrate within evangelical and other Protestant churches. It's really, the same type of thing that's infecting these Jewish communities, I think is happening in these other communities simply because youth are impressionable. So last question is, I've
I mean,
noticed that
just before you get, I want to agree with your point about the people that you've heard, who are saying that they're not going to, temple or synagogue anymore, and I get that a lot as well when I speak about this, and this is not, an orthodox, non-orthodox issue. This is about denominations that are failing their congregants, that are not providing them with what they with what they expect. People want to go to temple or synagogue on a Friday night, on a Saturday morning, or any other day, and they want religious nourishment. They don't want a political rally, and it speaks to the emptiness of so much of what's being offered, that they're not getting that, and they're turning away, and it's understandable why. I mean, and you're giving an example that Chabad Lubavitch is now an enormous movement in America, and while conservative Judaism, for example, is in serious decline, and these conservative and reformed Jews that are going to Chabad minions are not becoming, Hasidic, and sometimes their politics can still say the same, and they can still be liberal or whatever, and that's totally fine. But the point is that they're coming to these synagogues instead because they want a religious experience. They don't want a political rally. So the point is that you can offer the sort of a spiritual experience, a religious experience, without it being politics, and without needing to to become to take on different political views for that to happen.
right, and I think unfortunately we're seeing, there's a vacuum of leadership, and I don't think that I see anywhere where it's coming from. Especially, I mean, you mentioned Chabad, and I know people were Chabad representatives on campuses, and they, not to get too into specifics, but the mentality among them is that they're in some ways under siege because Chabad is an outreach organization. They're meant to present a very, very concrete idea, about not one idea obviously, but they're meant to present a perspective on authentic Hasidic Judaism to Jews who are, in many cases, alienated from Judaism. They don't come from, I would say, Jewish oriented households. And in the contemporary campus, they have to deal with things like transgenderism. They have to deal with things like the anti-Israel movement, the apartheid week, what's it called, BDS, um, all sorts of other things, the BLM movement. And they're in a very difficult position because these children are coming to them, and they are children, even though they've reached the age of adulthood, and their new values that are being imparted to them by both professors and their peers, in some cases their parents, directly clash with the ones that Chabad are about, which are, they're very much about, tradition, and what else is Chabad about? The Chabad is what? It's wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, right? And and most of that is directly from Jewish texts, including the Torah, including Hasidic texts from the 18th century, which nowadays probably would not be very progressive. A lot of them talk about obviously spiritual themes, but they do talk about a little bit of a more separate philosophy of Judaism as opposed to the rest of civilization. Um, so yeah, I don't know if you've spoken to any of their representatives over there in the UK, because over here they don't seem to be. I mean, they're real troopers, but they seem to be a bit like besieged, in my opinion.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think they're walking um, a very difficult tightrope, and they want to attract Jews to engage, with the Judaism that they have on offer, and they don't want to, they don't want to do anything to put them off. And I can understand that it's a difficult tightrope, and kudos to them.
And this is, mind you, this is another thing I wanted to mention. in many cases, these are people who they move into the middle of nowhere. They don't have institutions to support their lifestyle, whether it's dietary needs, educational needs, in some cases, funding. It's very difficult. I mean, obviously, I've met people who criticize the Chabad movement, but the people there, they bring their children and wives in order to sort of be a resource to the people around them. And it's just not a hospitable environment for many of them.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's very
their
yeah.
kids have to grow up in that environment. I have noticed that among American Jewish society, our celebrity representatives and community leaders are overwhelmingly supportive of Tikkun Olam and its political and social agenda as far as gender and sexuality, as well as political alignment. As such, the far left of the Jewish community is in many cases even further on the radical fringe, as shown by groups such as Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. In the UK, you have seen similar issues with Jewish Voice for Labor. Where do those that disagree with that agenda among the Jewish communities turn for an alternative, if there even is one?
I think what we've seen, very interestingly, in the last few years is actually a much more emboldened kind of political and kind of political right in the community, particularly in the American community. And the most obvious kind of comparison is the sort of comparison of the Obama Jews and the Trump Jews, basically. And you see for the first time Jews from more kind of conservative, politically conservative backgrounds, including several very high-profile Orthodox Jews, but not exclusively. People like David Friedman and Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt, but also outside of the Jewish community, even people like Stephen Mnuchin and Stephen Miller as well, and plenty of others. And I mean, of course, Ivanka as well. This is a very different scenario, and one that is, I think, much more hospitable to certainly kind of traditionalist Jewish communities and Orthodox communities, and obviously for Israel, for Israel as well. So there are kind of models there at the top that are very different from what we saw in the Obama administration and the Jews who kind of populated that White House. And there is a kind of zeitgeist here. There are other organizations now rising. Certainly in the religious world, there's the kind of the Coalition for Jewish Values that is now kind of rabbinic umbrella body that is now kind of competing with the kind of liberal rabbi groups that have been around for a long time and are actually saying, no, we're now fed up of you kind of claiming
to represent us.
Yeah, exactly. This is a ours is a Judaism that's just as legitimate, and other groups as well, like the Coalition for the Jewish Coalition for Religious Liberty. If I think I'm getting it right, that is that advocates for religious liberty issues from a legal point of view and files briefs at the Supreme Court and so on. So there are a number of organizations that are starting to kind of getting involved. There's others like the Tikva Fund as well, although that's more kind of ecumenical and educational. The Jewish Leadership Conference that is also run by the Tikva Fund, that's now bringing hundreds of people together on an annual basis and so on. So there are organizations out there. There's of course literature. There's of course my book, which is hopefully a tool for people to start thinking for themselves as well. So I think we've seen in the last few years a kind of sea change in what's available, and I think it's really gratifying to see that people are starting to get involved, particularly in communities that used to be much more kind of quietist or much less involved and would rely on just things turning out okay and so on. But I think that there's the realization that their numbers are such now that they can make a difference, and also that they need to. That if they want society to move in a direction that's more in line with their views, then they have to act to make that happen. And we're seeing the effect of those sorts of Jews getting involved now in politics at the highest levels, what they can actually achieve, and it's remarkable. So I think for people coming from the kind of conservative side, I think this is a very kind of heartening time, certainly compared to what was, what prevailed before.
Yeah, I think I would say I'm much less optimistic, and I only say that because when under Obama I was already I was generally like less political, and most of it had like the political views I had were a little less to do with Israel and more to do with what were things that were going on here. But we've seen under Trump this rise of these, I would say there is like a very strong current within the Jewish community that they're viscerally against him, simply out of fear, and this fearful mentality of that segment of the community. I don't think it's only unique to them. I think a lot of the people within the community who are conservative as well, they react instead of being proactive. This weekend, for example, we had a synagogue here that was tagged with both racist and satanic symbols, and there's been kind of a panic in the air, and people are like, "What are we going to do?" And obviously, you've probably seen a lot of that in England because I've heard some of the reports, and that's my main criticism. And I love the book because it goes and traces within the community our problems in terms of misinterpretation of text and in terms of the ideas as they developed. But I think it's like I've never seen a group of people in such a poor state of communal leadership as I've seen in among American Jews. It's just breathtaking at some point.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And my optimism is more in terms of people from more kind of traditionalist and conservative backgrounds getting more involved than they have been in the past. But you're absolutely right to raise these other concerns. And on the other side of the ledger, in terms of where the far left is going within the community and outside of it, is very worrying and is very threatening. And that's certainly going to become worse before it becomes better. But at least some elements of the community are waking up to it. But I certainly don't expect the kind of the Tikkun Olam, certainly not the Tikkun Olam crowd, but even kind of other moderate Jews are not going to wake up to it. But at least there are some pockets that are starting to act in a way that they haven't before.
So we actually have one audience question, and then we can conclude, unless you have anything else to say. But RS is asking, do you think that there will be a generation or two of reforms continuing to exist, meaning Reform Jews, because they don't have as many children? I think a lot of them intermarry more. A lot of their children choose not to live in any sort of Jewish context. What's your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, I'm generally wary of making kind of demographic prognostications about the Jews because you never know. But certainly, current trends, are not favorable. I mean, you're talking about 70% outmarriage rate. That's Jews marrying non-Jews, and then they are statistically far less likely to bring their kids up as Jewish. And in some cases, there are there's baggage and issues that come along with that. Jews born to Jewish kids born to mixed couples can be quite confused about their identity, and everyone will have anecdotal evidence. Obviously, it's not everyone. There'll be some people who just have no interest in Judaism whatsoever. Others who really make an effort to get involved. There are plenty who are in a very confused situation where they're sort of not recognized as Jewish by everyone, or not by all parts of the community, or not welcomed into all parts of the community. It's a very difficult state, and actually, anecdotally, it's thought that quite a lot of the leaders of some of the anti-Israel movements on campus and so on actually are from these sorts of families, because they're in a very weird, difficult psychological state. And I'm sympathetic, but I think that's a problem that's likely to get worse. But certainly, a 70% outmarriage rate is clearly unsustainable, and the way that things are going, the future is not bright at all for Reform Judaism. And conservative Judaism is on the precipice anyway. But also for Reform Judaism, it's not looking good at all. So we will, we wait to see, but I think that's the direction. The only thing that I think one of the two main movements working the other way. One, as we mentioned, is Chabad, and the extent to which they can sustain things. I mean, Chabad today, the number of people going to Chabad shuls could well be the size of, some say that it's the size of conservative Judaism, really. So, it's potentially a huge movement. The other that I think is incredibly important is birthright. This is a huge endeavor over years now to bring young Jews to Israel who haven't been there before, haven't been on an organized trip there before. And the impact of that, I think, is enormous, particularly in the last few years when they've been thinking more about kind of follow-up and so on. I think that it is potentially going to have a very big effect. So those are the two kind of wild cards that I can that I'm thinking of. But whether the people involved in Chabad or in Birthright, whether they sustain the reform movement per se, I don't know. So that those two things might help the demographics of the Jewish community as a whole, but they're not necessarily going to help Reform Judaism.
Right. I think on the contrary, it's like the people who are running the reform movement. I think that in many cases, and this is my opinion. This is obviously not yours, but in many cases, when they loosen conversion standards and membership standards, what they're recognizing is that they don't have a path forward with the people that have gone to their synagogue or temples for decades and decades, because their children in many cases wander off and become, they either convert to a different religion, become atheists. They don't necessarily have an interest. So what they depend on are, in some cases, people who marry other people who want to be in the same social circle. And what we're seeing in many cases are, congregations where like the people themselves aren't really Jewish, but it doesn't matter because the stuff being discussed there isn't Jewish either. Just it's just like cosmetically Jewish. That's my opinion. And I say this even though I do know people who have gone to Reform temples, and my mom went to one for a little while, even though she was pretty openly, not very religious at all. I think that in many cases those congregations are, they're not there for religious purposes. They're more there for a sense of, belonging for some of those people, which, that's fine, but we're not talking about a future that is sustainable. And I think both statistics and the phenomenon that Mr. Neumann has been talking about, they both point to that. I think that's about it. Do you have any future projects you want to promote, or is there a place where perhaps you want people to reach out to you, or anything like that before we close?
Um, I'm tinkering with a few things. Anti-Semitism is something that I'm thinking a lot about. Obviously, we just had the whole Corbyn episode in the UK, so these are things that I'm thinking quite a lot about. But there's nothing kind of definite or public yet. And you can follow the book handle on Twitter. But otherwise, thank you so much for for watching, and it's great to be here. And thanks so much for a great conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you too, and I'm sure this will be, of course, published as a synopsis with the J.A, which is a Canadian Jewish news organization. They started in May. So we will continue to have other author interviews either published through them or through American Greatness more often. And you're always welcome back, and I'd like to communicate with you on other stuff later if you're interested.
That'd be
Uh,
great.
yeah, all right. Have a great day and see you guys later. Um, that's about it. Let me just promote the other links if I have them. You can find me on BitChute, also Bold Like a Leopard or Chef Leopard, on let me see, GAB.com at Starscream85, and on Minds.com at Chef